I'll never forget the morning I stepped out onto my land and saw the wreckage. Splintered wood lay scattered like broken bones across the dirt. My fence, the one I'd built with my own 2 hands under the burning sun, wasn't just damaged. It was obliterated. Whole sections were gone, ripped apart as if someone had taken a saw and carved through weeks of sweat and labor like it was nothing. At first, I tried to believe it was nature, maybe a storm in the night. Maybe a bull had gotten riled up and pushed through. But when I followed the trail of hoofprints stretching off into the horizon, my gut told me the truth. This wasn't an accident. It was sabotage. And in that moment, one name came to my mind like a curse. Karen. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. Clipboard in hand, visor pulled low, barking orders like she owned the whole damn county. She thought tearing down my fence would break me, that it would show everyone she was in charge. But what she didn't realize is that all she'd done was light a fuse that led straight to me. And I've got 200 bison standing behind me. I don't scare easy. Life on a ranch has its own rhythm. The mornings come early, long before the sun breaks over the mountains. You hear the groan of barn doors, the shuffle of cattle, the breath of the earth still heavy with dew. Out here, there's a peace you can't find anywhere else. It's hard-earned, carved out with sweat, grit, and patience. Every nail in that fence was a piece of me. Every plank a reminder that this land was mine, fair and square. But peace doesn't last long when you've got people like Karen sniffing around. See, the HOA governs the little suburban development down the road. Cookie-cutter houses, clipped lawns, white picket fences, all lined up like toys. That's their world, not mine. My ranch was here generations before their cul-de-sacs even existed. My deed is older than their entire association. But Karen, she couldn't stand that. Couldn't stand the idea that someone lived outside her bubble, free from her rules. She'd drive her Lexus past my gate, slowing down just enough to scribble notes like some wannabe code enforcer. Once she even stopped, leaned against her car and snapped pictures of my barn. Said it was unsightly. Unsightly. That was her word for my land, my livelihood, my bloodline. At first, I laughed it off. People like her, they feed on attention. Ignore them and they move on. At least that's what I thought. But Karen wasn't like most people. She wasn't satisfied with control. She wanted conquest. And in her eyes, conquering me meant dragging my ranch under the HOA's umbrella, whether I liked it or not. The letters came first. Neatly typed warnings on HOA letterhead stuffed in my mailbox. Failure to comply with landscaping standards may result in fines. Landscaping standards on a cattle ranch. I crumpled them up and tossed them into the fire pit. Then came the visits. A couple of board members in polo shirts and loafers, men who'd never held a shovel in their lives, showed up sweating under the summer sun, telling me how simpler it would be if I just joined. Think of the property values, one of them said. I nearly laughed in his face. But the real battle was the meetings. Against my better judgment, I attended one. I wanted to make my position clear. I walked into their clubhouse, a glorified rental hall with fake stone walls and folding chairs. Karen stood at the front like a dictator, visor gleaming, clipboard raised like a scepter. When it was my turn, I said it plain and simple. This ranch is not part of your HOA. It never was and it never will be. My land, my rules. The room stirred, some whispering, some frowning, but Karen's smile never faltered. She tapped her clipboard, leaned forward, and said, "We'll see about that." And that's when I knew. This wasn't over. This was war. Not the kind fought with fists or guns, but with humiliation, sabotage, and 1,000 little cuts meant to bleed me dry. And Karen, she just fired the first shot. The first shot was fired the moment she said those words. "We'll see about that." I walked out of that meeting with my jaw tight, boots striking the pavement harder than I intended. Every step felt heavier. Because deep down I knew people like Karen don't stop. They don't get tired. They don't back off. They push. And they push until something breaks. The letters didn't stop. They multiplied. Bold stamps across the top, failure to comply, notice of violation. The HOA's seal was plastered like a brand on every envelope. Most mornings I'd find one waiting in my mailbox, smug little reminders that Karen was watching. One even accused me of failure to maintain uniform fence color. On a ranch where the fence has been kissed by mud, sun, and sweat. Where each post tells a story of seasons endured. They wanted it painted white, like their perfect little cul-de-sac ornaments. I crumpled the notice in my hand until it tore, tossed it into the dirt, and kept walking. But that wasn't enough for her. One evening, I drove home to find a pile of gravel dumped across my road. Not much, just enough to scrape the undercarriage of my truck if I wasn't careful. When I called the county, they told me the road wasn't theirs. It was under HOA oversight. I hung up the phone with my jaw clenched so hard I thought my teeth might crack. She wasn't just needling me anymore. She was sabotaging me. Then came the lawsuit threats. A thick envelope stuffed with legal jargon claiming my barn, built decades before her subdivision even existed, was an unapproved structure. The letter demanded I either tear it down or face thousands in fines. I laughed out loud when I read it, but the laugh didn't last long, because underneath the humor was a pressure that pressed into my chest. Karen wasn't playing fair anymore. She was weaponizing the system. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about a fence or a barn. This was about humiliation. She wanted me broken. She wanted the county, the neighbors, the entire town to see me as the fool who couldn't control his own land. The breaking point came one night in early spring. The dogs started barking, low and mean, their hackles raised like they'd smelled death itself. I grabbed my flashlight, pulled on my boots, and stepped out into the cool night air. The beam cut across the pasture, and my stomach dropped. My fence, my shield, my line in the sand, it wasn't just broken, it was gutted. Entire sections sawed clean at the posts, timber scattered like matchsticks across the dirt. Beyond the wreckage, shadows moved, my herd scattering into the darkness. Hooves thundered against the earth as they bolted into open ground. I dropped to my knees, ran my hand across the splintered wood. Fresh cuts, sharp edges biting into my palm. No storm did this. No wild animal. This was deliberate. And I didn't need to see her standing there to know whose hands were behind it. Karen's fingerprints were all over this. By dawn, the tire tracks told the rest of the story. Neat grooves in the mud leading away from the destroyed posts, and wedged deep in the dirt like a calling card, a scrap of paper. An HOA pamphlet. Their next community cleanup day. She hadn't even bothered to cover her tracks. Humiliation burned through me like fire. Out here, a man's fence isn't just wood and wire, it's his word. It's his dignity. And Karen had torn mine down like it was nothing. The whispers spread faster than wildfire. At the feed store, I felt them on my back like smoke. Did you hear? His cattle broke loose on the highway. Karen says he can't even control his own land. That was her game, not just to tear me down, but to turn me into a joke, to make me the punchline at every dinner table in town. But humiliation, I've learned, is a strange thing. It cuts you open, yes, but it also hardens you. It sharpens your edges until you're no longer breakable. Karen thought she'd broken me that night. She thought cutting through my fence had left me defeated. But the truth, all she'd done was awaken something in me. And she was about to find out just how dangerous that could be. Humiliation cuts deeper than any saw. The night my herd broke loose, I thought the worst of it was the shattered wood in my hands, the hoofprints scattered across open ground. But the real blow came later. It came when I walked into the feed store and felt every whisper trail me like smoke. Did you hear? His cattle broke loose. Karen says he can't even control his own land. That was her plan all along. Break my fence, break my dignity, turn me into the punchline of her little empire. But humiliation doesn't make me weak. It fuels me. It sharpens me. And standing there, dust on my boots, jaw tight, I realized, if Karen wanted to play games in public, then I'd meet her in public. The next HOA meeting came sooner than I thought. I walked in late, boots still muddy from the pasture, hat pulled low. Karen was already at the front, clipboard raised like a scepter, visor gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Her voice dripped with smugness as she addressed the crowd. As you can all see, she said, flashing pictures of my broken fence, this ranch property isn't just unsightly, it's unsafe. His livestock are a danger to our community. Without HOA oversight, it will only get worse. The crowd murmured, some nodded, some frowned. But Karen thrived on the noise, basking in it like a queen on her throne. Then her eyes flicked to me and that smug smile widened. Ah, she said sweetly, the man of the hour. Care to explain how your cattle managed to roam free? I let the silence stretch, my boots planted firm. Then I spoke, my voice steady. They roamed free because someone cut through my fence, and I think we all know who has the most to gain from that. Gasps rippled through the room. Heads turned. Side eyes darted toward Karen, but she didn't flinch. She leaned forward, both hands gripping the podium. Maybe if you played by the rules, she sneered. Fences wouldn't be your problem. Maybe it's time you realized this community doesn't revolve around your ranch. Right there in front of everyone, she declared war. I walked out of that clubhouse with my chest burning, but not from shame anymore. From fire, from resolve. If Karen wanted a spectacle, I'd give her one, but it wouldn't be the kind she expected. And the perfect stage came the night of the spring HOA gala. Now let me be clear, the gala wasn't my scene. It was held in their so-called community clubhouse, a rental hall dressed up with twinkle lights, plastic tablecloths, and the sour smell of cheap Chardonnay. But I showed up anyway, because I was done letting Karen control the story. She stood at the podium in a sequin blouse, rhinestone headband catching the light, clipboard still clutched in her hands like it was part of her body. She spoke like she was running for governor. Ladies and gentlemen, we gather tonight to celebrate another year of progress. Our lawns are greener, our homes brighter, our property values higher than ever before. This is what community looks like. Applause rippled through the room. I stood in the back, arms crossed, jaw tight. Then she pivoted, her eyes locked on me. But not all of us share that vision. Some of us cling to outdated ways. Some of us put personal interest above community. And as we've all seen, those choices come at a cost. The screen behind her flickered to life, a slideshow. First, my broken fence. Then, my herd wandering the roadside. Finally, a grainy shot of me sweating under the sun, hammer in hand, repairing posts like a man barely holding it together. The crowd gasped, some with pity, some with disgust. Karen smiled like a cat with a canary. This, she announced, her voice sharp as glass, is why we must consider stricter enforcement. One weak link endangers us all. My fists clenched so hard my knuckles burned. Enough. I stepped forward, boots echoing against the tile. That's enough, Karen. Every head turned. She didn't flinch, she thrived on the attention. Enough, she repeated with mock surprise. Tell me what's enough, Mr. Rancher. Enough neglect, enough unsafe practices, enough endangering our families with your livestock. The crowd leaned in, hungry for drama. I met her gaze, my voice steady but hard. You talk about community like it's your kingdom, but all you've done is tear it apart. You cut my fence. You let my herd loose. And you did it because you can't stand the idea of someone living free outside your HOA bubble. Gasps tore through the room, some shifted uncomfortably. Some searched Karen's face for denial. But she didn't deny it. She laughed, actually laughed. Oh, please, no one believes that fairy tale. You can't even control your own property, and now you're blaming me. You think anyone here buys it? The silence that followed was heavy. Some nodded with her. Some turned away, and that's when it hit me. Karen had won this round. In their eyes, I wasn't the victim. I was the fool. I walked out into the night, heat burning in my chest, humiliation clawing deeper than ever. But humiliation is fuel. And that night, as I looked across my pasture at 200 restless bison shifting under the moonlight, I realized something. If Karen wanted to make a spectacle of me, I'd give her one. A spectacle she'd never forget. Some plans are born out of spreadsheets and tidy calendars. Mine was born out of humiliation, anger, and a hunger for balance. That night after the gala, I sat on my porch with the cool wind against my face, staring out at the dark outlines of my herd. 200 bison shifted restlessly, massive shoulders rippling under the moonlight, breath rising in clouds of steam. They didn't look like livestock anymore. They looked like an answer. Karen wanted to turn me into a spectacle. Fine, I'd give her a spectacle she'd never forget. At first, it was just a joke in my head. What if the bison stormed her precious HOA office? What if the ground shook beneath their boots and her clipboard flew from her hand? But the more I thought about it, the less it felt like a joke. The more it felt like justice. Because if Karen believed her power came from paper, letters, fines, bylaws, then maybe the only way to break her was with something she could never control: nature itself. The days after the gala felt different, charged, like the air before a storm. Every evening I'd sit on the fence line, watching the herd. I knew them better than I knew myself. I knew how they clustered near the gates at dusk, how they surged as one when startled, how even the earth seemed to tremble beneath their weight. They were chaos waiting for a spark, and I was ready to strike the match. But even as the plan took shape in my mind, doubt clawed at me in the dark. Bison aren't toys. They're not cattle. They're heavier, faster, meaner. Once they start moving, there's no stopping them. People could get hurt. Property would be wrecked. Late at night, I'd hear that voice whisper in my head, "Maybe this is too far." Then I'd remember the fence, the broken posts, the laughter in Karen's voice as she mocked me in front of everyone, the slideshow of my humiliation, and the doubt would harden into steel. She pushed me until I broke, so now I'd break her. The first step was reconnaissance. I drove past the HOA office a few times under the pretense of errands, taking in every detail. The building was a single-story prefab painted beige to look professional. A parking lot wrapped around it, lined with neatly trimmed hedges. Behind it, a slope stretched down toward open ground. If a gate happened to swing open at the right time, a herd could pour down that slope like a river through a canyon, straight into their office. The timing had to be perfect. Karen loved her meetings. She insisted on gathering the entire board once a month, usually on Thursday evenings around 7. Everyone hated them, but Karen, she strutted through those gatherings like she was presiding over a royal court. That was the night. That was when they'd all be gathered in one place, boxed neatly inside the walls of their little empire. Preparation became my ritual. I reinforced certain gates, oiled hinges so they'd swing smooth and silent. I spread extra feed closer to the gate in the evenings, conditioning the herd to linger nearby. They grew restless, snorting, pawing at the dirt, as if they could feel the energy poolsing from me. Sometimes I swore their dark eyes glinted like they knew what was coming. Meanwhile, I played my part as the beaten man. At the feed store, I kept my head down. Neighbors whispered about me, about my cattle, about the HOA's slideshow. I let them. Karen even sent me another notice, this time citing excessive noise from livestock. I smiled when I read it. She had no idea what kind of noise was coming her way. But here's the thing about revenge. It's a double-edged blade. It cuts both ways. In the quiet moments, I thought about the risk. What if someone got trampled? What if the sheriff came after me? Was it worth it? And every time, the answer was the same. Karen would never stop. Not until I reminded her that this land didn't bow to her, that clipboards and bylaws couldn't tame what was wild. I'd show her. I pictured it in my head, the board mid-meeting. Karen droning on about community standards when suddenly the ground begins to tremble, papers flutter. Someone peers out the window, their face draining of color as the first bison thunders into the lot. Then another. Then 200. Chairs crash, phones drop. Karen's rhinestone headband topples as the wild comes roaring through her kingdom. The thought made me grin for the first time in weeks. No more humiliation, no more whispers, just dust, hooves, and chaos, a storm she could never contain. And as the day of the meeting drew closer, I felt it building inside me. The fuse Karen had lit was almost at the powder. And when it blew, nothing would be left standing. The ground trembled before the first sound broke the night. For a heartbeat, it was only a vibration under my boots, a low, rolling thrum that felt like the earth itself clearing its throat. Then the herd moved, and everything changed. I remember whispering to the dark, more to myself than to the animals. "Now!" The latch gave with a metallic clank that somehow sounded both small and enormous, like the opening line of a story that would not be forgotten. For a second, nothing happened. The world held its breath. Then the herd exploded into motion, a living ocean of muscle and fur and thunder. The sound hit like a wall, 100 drums beating in unison, hooves tearing at the dirt, clouds of dust swallowing the moonlight. The fence line blurred as a tide of bodies surged through. My chest shook with the force of it. I stood there, watching the silhouettes stamp across the pasture, feeling the weight of each one in my bones. They moved with an instinct older than bylaws or board meetings. They moved because they were called. I followed them at a distance, running up the ridge as they poured down the slope toward the HOA lot. From where I stood, I could see the office lights, a pale box against the dark. And then, like something out of a fever dream, the parking lot became a stage for chaos. Cars rocked on their axles as massive bodies brushed past. Headlights strobed like frantic eyes. Alarms shrieked, a thin human sound swallowed by the Bison's thunder. Inside, the meeting froze mid-sentence. I watched through the glass as faces went from smug to stunned. Karen was at the podium, rhinestones catching the light, mouth open like a bird's. Papers lifted into the air as everyone craned toward the windows. Then the first head appeared, a blunt, horned silhouette smashing through a plate of glass. Glass exploded inward in a glittering, dangerous rain. Chairs went over. People dived, screaming, arms clutching at each other. The sound was a chaos of human terror and animal power, impossible to untangle. Two bulls charged across the walkway and blocked the doors like living barricades. A woman slipped and was hauled up by her neighbor, both stumbling into a shrub that only yesterday had been a prize flower bed. The landscaping turned to ragged wreckage in moments, mulch flung, banners shredded, hedges flattened beneath hooves. Somewhere near the back, a projector rolled off its stand with a hollow smash, the slideshow of my humiliation reduced to a smear on the carpet. I watched Karen try to command the room, to herd people the way she'd tried to herd me. Her clipboard lay abandoned on the floor, a pathetic little rectangle amid the storm. She scrambled toward the exit, heels slipping, rhinestones flashing like broken promises. Two bison crossed her path and she skidded backwards, tumbling into a potted plant. For the first time in months, I saw something other than smugness in her face. Fear. Raw, animal fear. I should have felt a rush of triumph then, the sweet, cinematic revenge I'd imagined 1,000 times. And for a flicker, I did. Watching her claw at the tile while the world she'd built buckled felt like vindication carved into bone. But the rush was tangled with something else. The sound of children sobbing down the street. The way a man clutched his chest as he tried to breathe under a fallen chair. The scream of an ambulance that hadn't arrived yet because the roads were blocked by hooves and overturned cars. My chest tightened. The herd moved through the lot like a storm passing through a town, destructive, unstoppable, and then slowly beginning to recede. Some of them pressed against the building, horns scraping drywall, breath fogging glass before they turned and drifted back toward the open field. The noise faded into thudding echoes, then into the low, distant moan of animals walking home. Dust settled in layers over the wreck like ash. When the last of them disappeared into the darkness, silence fell, a heavy, ringing quiet that felt almost indecent after the noise. I stood at the edge of the lot watching Karen slump against the reception desk, clutching the broken remains of her clipboard as if it could shield her from what had just happened. Board members crawled from under tables, faces streaked with dirt and tears, eyes hollowed by what they'd seen. A man at the far end whispered, half stunned, "He wasn't kidding. You don't mess with him." I didn't go in. I didn't need to. The message had been delivered in hoofprints and shattered glass, and the way the earth had remembered that it belonged to something older than bylaws. I turned and walked back up the ridge as the first sirens far off started to wail. Behind me, the office looked like a small war zone, windows dark and jagged, papers scattered like confetti, a toppled flagpole embedded in a crabbed hedge. For a brief, private moment, I allowed myself something that felt almost like sorrow, not for what I'd done, for the necessity of it, but for what had been broken that couldn't be easily fixed. Trust, the fragile idea that people could solve their problems without resorting to force. I felt the weight of it in my hands like a stone. Then the herd's low bellows drifted across the field and steadied me. They were already moving back toward the pasture as if they understood their part had been played. As I watched them disappear, I whispered into the night, not triumphantly but with a kind of weary resolve. "You wanted a lesson, Karen, you got one." The wind carried the words away. I had set the storm loose. There would be consequences, but for the first time in months something shifted. The scales had tipped. The balance, however crude, had been restored, at least for now. By sunrise, the county buzzed like a hive kicked open. News of the Bison storm spread faster than fire in a dry canyon. People who hadn't set foot near my land in years suddenly had stories to tell. By noon, reporters swarmed the subdivision like vultures circling a carcass. Cameras pointed at shattered windows, trampled flower beds, and light poles bent like twigs. Karen stood front and center, of course. Hair frazzled, blouse streaked with dust, her rhinestone headband clinging for dear life. She held her broken clipboard against her chest like a shield. Her voice cracked as she painted herself and the HOA as innocent victims of a reckless rancher gone mad. "This man endangered lives," she barked into the microphones, stabbing her finger toward the cameras. "He unleashed 200 wild beasts on hardworking families. He should be arrested immediately." But something had shifted. The reporters weren't nodding along. They weren't swallowing her words like gospel anymore. One raised his hand. "Mrs. Holloway, isn't it true your association has no jurisdiction over his property?" Another chimed in. "We've heard allegations that the ranch fence was deliberately cut before the incident. Can you comment on that?" Karen stammered, her lips twitched, her eyes darted, but the polished mask cracked. For once her words didn't carry weight, they sounded hollow. "I didn't show my face. Didn't need to. I stayed on the ranch, repairing fence posts with steady hands while the story told itself. At the feed store, old man Jenkins leaned on the counter, drawling to anyone who'd listen. That rancher's fence was fine till someone cut it. I seen the saw marks myself." Neighbors backed him up. Stories came out about HOA trucks lurking near my property at odd hours. About Karen bragging she'd teach him a lesson. One by one, the pieces lined up, and with every whisper, her empire corroded. 2 days later, the sheriff came to my porch, hat in hand, eyes tired like he hadn't slept. "Heard you had quite the livestock incident," he said. "Depends who you ask," I replied, leaning against the rail. He sighed. "Karen's pushing hard for charges, but between you and me, you're in the clear. Fence was tampered with, heard had a right to roam, and with half the town swearing they saw HOA folks sneaking around, let's just say the DA isn't interested." I nodded. Relief should have washed over me, but it didn't, because I wasn't after legal vindication. I wasn't after the sheriff's blessing. I wanted Karen to face the weight of her own making. And that weight was getting heavier by the day. Within a week, cracks split through her board. Members resigned quietly at first, then in waves. One muttered, "I didn't sign up for this," as he loaded boxes into his trunk. Another told the local paper, "She's lost it. Obsessed." Karen doubled down. She called emergency meetings. She sent letters stuffed with threats of new assessments to cover office repairs. She tried to bill homeowners thousands for Bison damage fees. It backfired spectacularly. At a heated gathering in the clubhouse, residents shouted her down. "Why should we pay for your war with the rancher?" one woman demanded, waving the bill in Karen's face. Karen snapped back, voice cracking. It was for the safety of the community. But safety was the last thing anyone felt under her reign. Her authority slipped like sand through her fingers. And me? I didn't have to lift a finger. I sat on my porch, sipping black coffee, watching the implosion unfold from afar. Cars streamed in and out of the subdivision, lawyers. Vans parked outside the office, petitions changed hands like wildfire. Karen was unraveling publicly, undone by the same obsession that had driven her to cut down my fence. But she wasn't finished, not yet. One evening, as the sun burned low behind the hills, a dust cloud trailed up my driveway. Karen's Lexus skidded to a halt at the base of my porch. She climbed out, visor strapped tight like armor, heels clicking against gravel. Her eyes blazed. "You think this is over?" she hissed. I leaned against the post, calm, steady. "Looks like it's over to me." She took a step closer, finger jabbing at me. "You humiliated me. You ruined everything. But I'll rebuild. The HOA will rebuild. And when we do, you'll regret the day you crossed me." Her words quivered with desperation more than rage. I held her gaze. "Karen, you already crossed me when you tore down my fence. Everything since then, that's just you reaping what you sowed." Her lips trembled. She spun on her heels, stomped back to her car. But I saw it in her shoulders, the slump of defeat, the cracks in her armor. And as the taillights vanished down the drive, I knew one truth. Karen wasn't fighting for control anymore. She was fighting not to drown. And the tide was still rising. The tide was rising, and Karen was running out of air. The county announced the investigation a week later. Not into me, into the HOA, misuse of funds, intimidation tactics, even property tampering, and whose name topped every document, Karen's. The headlines spread like wildfire. HOA president under scrutiny after Bison stampede. For the first time, she wasn't in control of the narrative. She was the headline. She was the scandal. Her empire collapsed in pieces. One bored resignation, one angry neighbor, one news clip replayed on the evening broadcast, and with each crack I felt lighter. By early summer, the once pristine HOA office looked like an abandoned bunker. Windows boarded up, flower beds shriveled into weeds, cracks spiderwebbed through the parking lot. Where once she held court, silence had taken over. But Karen refused to let go. She clung to her title like a crown slipping from her head. Letters still went out, shrill notices demanding dues from homeowners who had long since stopped paying. Most ended up in the trash. A few pinned to bulletin boards at the feed store where folks laughed over them like bad comic strips. She thought fear would still carry weight, but fear only works when people believe in your power, and her power was rotting in front of everyone. The end didn't come with fireworks, it came with paperwork. One morning, I walked into the county clerk's office with a leather folder I'd kept locked away for years. Inside, deeds, survey maps, transfer papers, records dating back to the late 1800s, proof that my family had owned this land long before cul-de-sacs or HOA bylaws ever existed. Buried in those records was something Karen had never thought to question, the small 1-acre parcel her precious HOA office sat on. That land wasn't theirs. It was mine. The clerk stamped the papers with a thud that echoed through the room. She slid them back across the counter and said, "Says here you're the rightful owner, has been for over a century. Guess someone never bothered to check the fine print." For the first time in months, I felt the ground steady under my feet. I didn't waste time. I drove straight to the office. Karen was inside, packing the lobby with what remained of her board, 2 weary loyalists, faces pale from weeks of ridicule. When I stepped in, the room froze. Her voice was sharp. "What are you doing here?" I laid the papers on the reception desk. Calm, steady. "I'm here to tell you to pack up. This office sits on my land, always has. You've got 30 days to vacate." She laughed, a brittle, hollow sound. "That's ridiculous. Everyone knows this is HOA property." "Everyone knows what you told them," I said. "But here's the truth. The county clerk stamped it this morning. It's mine. It's always been mine. You've been trespassing for years." Her face drained of color. She snatched the papers with shaking hands, flipping through them as though the words might change. Her board members leaned over her shoulder, eyes widening as the truth stared back at them. One of them whispered, "Karen, if this is true, we can't fight it. We'd be sued into the ground." Karen slammed the papers down, her hands trembling. "This is a trick. It has to be." I leaned in just close enough for her to see the steel in my eyes. "The only trick here is how long you manage to fool people, but it ends now, 30 days, then I want you off my property." The silence that followed was heavier than any stampede. The fluorescent light above us flickered, buzzing like it knew the fight was over. And for the first time since this war began, Karen didn't have an answer. She just stood there, clipboard limp in her hand, lips pressed tight against the truth she couldn't outrun. Her empire had been built on borrowed land. And the lease was up. The 30 days passed like the slow march of a clock toward execution. Every morning, I'd see trucks parked outside the HOA office, board members hauling out boxes, filing cabinets, broken furniture. Years of Karen's power reduced to cardboard and dust. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks, some cheering, some shaking their heads, as if watching a parade no one wanted but couldn't turn away from. The once mighty HOA had become spectacle, and Karen, its queen, was a monarch without a throne. She fought every inch of the way. She pleaded. She threatened lawsuits. She tried to rally the last few loyalists, waving notices in the air like a general with no army. But no one stood beside her anymore. Even her voice, once sharp, commanding, smug, cracked when she barked orders no one followed. On the final day, I walked down the cracked pavement toward the office one last time. Karen stood in the doorway, visor tilted low, her battered clipboard clutched to her chest like a lifeline. Her eyes burned with hatred, but beneath it I saw something new. Fear. "You'll regret this," she hissed, voice trembling. "You've destroyed everything." I held her gaze, steady as stone. "No, Karen, you destroyed yourself. I just showed everyone the truth." For a long moment she said nothing. Then she turned, heels clicking against the pavement, fading into silence. Her figure shrank against the horizon, visor glinting one last time before it disappeared. The office stood empty behind her, hollow and lifeless. I considered tearing it down, ripping it from the ground as completely as she had tried to rip me apart. But in the end, I left it standing. A shell. A monument to what happens when arrogance collides with truth. Back on the ranch, the air felt lighter. The fences stood tall again, rebuilt stronger than before. My herd grazed peacefully, no longer restless, no longer pressed against the gates as though waiting for battle. The storm had passed. The land was quiet again, the way it was always meant to be. Karen's name vanished from the headlines. The county closed its investigation with her reputation in ruins. The subdivision went back to its small, ordinary quarrels, lawn height, paint color, who left their trash bin out too long. But her voice was gone. Her reign was over. And me, I had my dignity back. Not because of the chaos I unleashed, but because I never let her take what mattered most. My ground, my truth, my will to stand firm. Looking back, I realized this fight was never just about fences or bylaws. It wasn't even about Bison or lawsuits. It was about something older, deeper. About what a man becomes when someone tries to strip him of everything he's built. Karen believed power came from titles, from clipboards and meetings and fear. But real strength comes from patience, from resilience, from knowing when to stand tall even if you stand alone. Sometimes dignity doesn't look like pride. Sometimes it looks like sacrifice. Sometimes it looks like silence until the silence breaks. And when it does break, when the storm finally comes, it doesn't ask permission. It doesn't follow bylaws. It moves like thunder across the earth, unstoppable, undeniable. I don't regret unleashing the herd, not because of the destruction, but because of what it symbolized. That nature, truth, and grit will always outlast paper rules and hollow power. That you can cut down a man's fence, but you can't cut down his resolve. So here's the lesson Karen never wanted to learn. You don't win by control. You don't win by fear. Out here in the wide-open land, you win by grit, by patience, and by knowing when to unleash the storm. And when I did, when 200 bison answered my call and stampeded through the heart of her empire, I didn't just take back my land. I took back my dignity. The herd quieted, the fences stood strong, and for the first time in months, I felt peace settle over my land. Because sometimes the only way to be heard is to let your actions speak louder than their words. You've heard this confession, now wait until you hear the next one, the truth that shatters everything you thought you knew.